In this video, I'll take you on a guided tour of the only North American aviation F-107A currently on display anywhere in the world. I'll explain the history around this Century Series jet, why it had these unique engine inlets, and why they plan to strap massive rockets to it. I'm Stewart and I make videos about planes and a few rockets. This includes detailed tours through aircraft in museums and reviews on board flights around the world. If you're into these types of videos, then please check out my channel and subscribe. And a massive thanks to the Pima Air and Space Museum for letting me film this aircraft. The only other F-107 is in Dayton at the USAF Museum, and that's currently in storage. Let's start with some history. In 1953, North American Aviation began a study to look into a more powerful interceptor version of the F-100 Super Sabre called the NAA-211 or the F-100BI. Because it had a nose-mounted radar system, the air inlet had to be moved underneath. They also looked at a NAA-212 or F-100B tactical fighter bomber with a bomb bay and external hardpoints. The Air Force was showing more interest in the latter, so the developmental process started, but it would become evident early on that much more was going to be changed from the F-100, hence the new designation, the F-107 that we have here. In fact, here's footage of the two together, and while the paint does exaggerate the differences, the nose, the cockpit position, and the height of the fuselage are especially different. Starting at the very nose, and you'll notice a very long and thick boom with a pitot head installed. Now, being a prototype, this would be used to measure a whole array of parameters. It was positioned a long way forward because the early thinking was that supersonic shock waves would interfere with the reading of the instruments, but this boom would interfere with the radar, which was positioned behind it in the nose, so the pitot head was positioned on the wing's leading edge and the boom would have been removed on the production version. Multiple booms were used on this aircraft to compare and ensure accuracy. Radars were now becoming more advanced and larger, so the nose-mounted intake from the F-100 had to either grow and allow a radar in the center like this MiG, or be positioned elsewhere, and I'll come back to that. Now, a requirement for this jet was the ability to carry a nuclear bomb, and it was decided to position it in a recessed weapons bay underneath. But not having it fully enclosed, it allowed for a smaller fuselage, as remember that they wanted to reduce as many changes from the F-100 fuselage as possible, but it would produce more drag. Coming back to the air intake, and a chin-mounted design similar to the Vought F-8 Crusader was considered, but it would interfere with the aerodynamics of the bomb bay. Now, you may not have thought about this, but dropping the bomb isn't as simple as it sounds, as the aircraft itself, especially at high speed, can have unexpected effects on the airflow that could affect the bomb drop, as you can see here. There also wasn't enough room with the weapons bay, and raising everything up would just create a taller fuselage with a larger forward cross-section. Now, it's interesting to compare the F-86 Sabre, which had nose-mounted intakes, and a pilot sitting above the intake tunnel, while the MiG-15 also had nose intakes, but the air was directed along two tunnels on either side of the cockpit. The F-86 had a taller fuselage, and the cockpit had greater visibility, but also a larger forward cross-section which had to be overcome with more power. But back to the F-107A. Another alternative would have been an underside intake system similar to the F-16, in fact that was considered, as you can see with this image, or side-mounted intakes like the F-111 or the F-22. The reality is that that is now the design used by many, but they do make for a wider fuselage with an associated increased drag. So they did what no one else was doing and positioned the intakes on the top of the fuselage, which created other challenges which I'll get to soon. Now, guns weren't fitted to this example, but in a separate prototype and roughly in this position, there were either four 20mm Pontiac M39 cannons with 800 rounds in total, or one 20mm 6-barrel M61 Vulcan autocannon. There were two hardpoints on each wing, with the inner one carrying a 1,000-pound general-purpose bomb, a rocket pod with 36 2.75-inch unguided rockets, a 275-gallon fuel tank, or even napalm. On the outer hardpoint, much of the same, albeit lighter, or even chaff dispensing pods. In the center of the fuselage was this semi-recessed ordnance station. In this example here, there is a 500-gallon centerline fuel tank, as you can see in this drawing. Another option was a 250-gallon centerline saddle tank, and attached to that, and here's a photo of it, was what became the B-28 thermonuclear bomb. These were produced from 1958 and remained in service until the early 1990s. Their smaller size allowed them to be used on smaller fighters such as the F-100, F-104 and 105, and the B-47, 52 and 66 bombers. Their blast yield was 70 up to 1,450 kilotons, and just to compare, the Hiroshima bomb was just 15 kilotons, so this was monumentally more destructive. These bombs could be delivered in two ways. Either gravity dropped and at speeds of up to Mach 2.2, which is what you want to be doing to get away before they detonate, or via the LABS, which stands for the Low Altitude Bombing System, or the toss bombing method. This would work by the aircraft pulling upwards and releasing the bomb also in an upward trajectory, and then fly upside down before recovering and leaving the area as fast as possible. Testing of this delivery method made for some incredible footage of the B-47 Stratojet upside down, as shown in my guided tour video around that aircraft. Looking down at the main landing gear, and it's a standard tricycle layout with a steerable nose wheel at the front, but was uprated for the heavier aircraft. Unlike the F-100, the main gear was attached to the fuselage instead of the wings. Now, apologies for the tangent, but there's a lot more that goes into landing gears than simple distribution of weight. The British TSR-2 intentionally had massive wheels, with the idea being that a Soviet attack could destroy the runways. Therefore, this might need to take off from grass or from just a regular traffic road. The MiG-25's landing gear, which I'm filming shortly and excited to explore, and that's also much larger so that it can operate from a rough Soviet runway. The negative of this design is that the large landing gear takes up a lot more space within the fuselage when it's retracted. The F-107A, by contrast, was expected to operate from smooth runways, and therefore could get away with smaller wheels that take up a lot less space within the fuselage. Moving out, and we have a look at the swept wing and its leading edge slats, as you can see deployed here. At low speed, these would deploy automatically and improve low speed lift, and as airspeed increased, the air itself would close the slats to improve high-speed performance. This boom here on the side had the pitot head that I mentioned earlier. And you can see a warning of no handhold to ensure some enthusiastic ground crew weren't using this for pull-ups. On the trailing edge, there were no ailerons, so roll control was provided by 3 spoilers above the wing and deflectors underneath it. This novel system was found to work better at high angles of attack and higher speeds than the traditional aileron design. In fact, they were so effective with roll control that at higher speeds, the outer of the 3 panels would lock closed to ensure that the whole plane didn't roll too fast. Further in were blown flap mechanisms, where air was bled from the turbojet engine and blown out of these ducts here and along the flap, increasing lift and enabling a 30 mph lower landing speed. If we just quickly scroll back, and you'll notice the roundel, which if we jump onto the other side quickly, you'll see that the starboard wing doesn't have one. Obviously, these are here to identify which team the aircraft is on, but the problem was that many roundels looked similar, so by only having one on the port side wing helped differentiate American aircraft. There was also an idea that when targeting a plane with guns, your eyes are drawn to the center of 2 distinguishing objects, such as the roundels, which would put the fuselage right in the center. But only having one, the idea was that the attacking pilot might veer the aim off to the side. Even on modern American aircraft, only the port side gets the roundel, admittedly in low visibility paint, just in case you're wondering who might be operating this B-2 Spirit that you've come across. Moving on to the aft fuselage, and it's interesting that prototypes print explanations all over the panels to help the ground crew, which makes sense as they're probably not going to be familiar with it. Under here was access to the control surface mechanisms, the fuel gauge probe, and fuel cell. This whole panel here was an air brake, which you can see in action here. Moving back, and we have the bare metal covering of the engine, which would have obviously been extremely hot, making painting it potentially problematic, and it also helped expel the heat. Inside this was a single Pratt & Whitney YJ75 turbojet producing 24,500 pounds of thrust with an afterburner. The production version of this engine went on to be used in many other jets, including the Lockheed U-2, the F-105, the F-106, and the Boeing 707. It could push this up to 890 miles per hour or 1,432 kilometers an hour at sea level, or at 36,000 feet, 1,295 miles an hour or 2,084 kilometers an hour. It had a service ceiling of 53,200 feet, but once during testing did pass 69,000 feet. It had a variable exhaust nozzle to maximize thrust, which can squeeze the exhaust similar to how you can increase the water pressure by putting a finger over part of the hose. In the base of the vertical fin was a brake parachute, which you can see printed on it. Brakes on these older aircraft were fairly basic, so these were vital to bring the aircraft to a stop. We have an all-moving vertical tail rather than the fixed fin with a rudder on the trailing edge like many other aircraft of that era. The idea was that at supersonic speed, the forward or leading edge would create a shockwave moving back, and that would interfere with the effectiveness of the control surface behind it. Therefore, they just used the whole structure as the control surface itself. This structure here includes the tail navigation light, the radar warning antenna to detect an adversary targeting radar, and below that was a fuel venting system. It had a unique feature for that era, but now commonplace, a system to purge fuel vapor with far less flammable nitrogen gas, which was pumped into the emptying tank to help reduce the risk of an explosion during combat, such as if a stray bullet hit the tank and caused a spark. Now, while you can see the serial number, I'll mention the three that were built. This one, 555118, was the first ever F-107A and first flew on September 10, 1956 at Edwards Air Force Base. Test pilot Bob Baker took it supersonic for the first flight, although he overshot the runway on landing due to a drag chute failure and it ended up in a ditch. It was repaired and flying 3 days later. It first passed Mach 2 on November 3, 1956. This aircraft here is now on display at the Pima Air and Space Museum after a total of 93 flights. The next one, 555119, first flew in November 28th of the same year and was equipped with 4 cannons. This one is currently in storage at the National Museum of the USAF in Dayton. And the final one, 555120, first flew in December 10th of the same year, and that was the first F-107 to have a fully automatic variable inlet duct system, but it didn't live up to expectations, and I'll mention that shortly. It was damaged on September 1, 1959 during an aborted takeoff, resulting in a blown tyre and a fire. While the pilot was thankfully uninjured, the plane was deemed too damaged to be repaired and scrapped. It went on to be used as a firefighting aid and eventually burnt. But back to this aircraft, 5118, and we have an all-moving tailplane for the same reason as I mentioned with the vertical section. In the center was a retractable ventral bumper to protect it from a tail strike during an aggressive rotation. Moving our way forward and towards the cockpit, and it really highlights the unusual look of this incredible design. Positioned under this panel was the RAT, which stands for the Ram Air Turbine. This is essentially a propeller and a generator that, in the instance of an engine failure, this would deploy into the airstream and the prop will rotate and generate electricity for some of the vital onboard systems. Another interesting point about the air intake was the VAID, which stands for the Variable Area Inlet Duct. This was a wedge-shaped splitter in the center with 4 hydraulically powered doors inside that would protrude or contract depending on the aircraft's speed. Turbojet engines could not ingest supersonic air, so this was designed to not impede any air at subsonic speed, but then slow it down once supersonic speed was reached. The first 2 prototypes had 2 positions, 3.25 and 12 degrees, while the third had a fully automatic and continuously adjustable doors. The system had constant problems, but was modified and upgraded, and a similar system was used in the A5 Vigilante, XF-108 Rapier, and the XB-70 Valkyrie and our tour around that incredible aircraft in another video. Just before we look at the cockpit, and I'll mention the ejection seat, which had to be exceptionally strong to not only clear the vertical tail, but the air inlet just behind it. Because there was no room for the canopy to slide backwards, it would open up like you see in this image. But because loose objects, and I suppose pilots, hence the nickname man-eater, from the cockpit could be sucked up into the engine, the canopy actuation was connected to the throttle, blocking it from opening more than 5 inches while the engine was turned on, or opening at all when the throttle was at more than 80%. The canopy was designed to be blown off during an emergency, but the ejection seat was also designed to just break up and through it as well. It's also worth mentioning that the pilot's visibility would have been worse with this engine intake design, but the thinking at the time was that missiles would be destroying the enemy outside of visual range, and that dogfighting was a thing of the past. But they didn't make the same mistake as the F-4 Phantom II designers initially did, as they still had guns as you saw earlier. Unfortunately, we couldn't move the canopy, so here are some photos of the cockpit in the second one, thanks to the National Museum of the USAF in Dayton. It had a centrally positioned control stick, with the North American Aviation logos visible here on the rudder pedals. There's the usual dials, and in pride of place, the Mach meter, which goes up to 2.2. There's a throttle hidden here behind the yellow ejection handle, and the landing gear control here. This here was the windscreen rain dispersal duct. Airflow over the windows is always the most effective way of clearing moisture, but as the airspeed reduces during landing and takeoff, it's less effective, hence why aircraft have wipers. This system would fix that problem by blowing air at the windscreen, simulating the faster airspeed. It was planned to have an in-flight refueling receptacle positioned on the port side opposite the rat, just above where I showed you the positions of where the guns were going to be. It also comes with an early fly-by-wire control system called the Augmented Longitudinal Control System, which was vital to help the pilot flying at such high speeds where inputs would be needed to be made in split seconds. Inside the nose, and it was planned to have the North American Aviation Autonetics Division XMA-12 Integrated Fire Control System, which would detect airborne targets, direct the aircraft towards them, and attack with guns or missiles. The radar system for this would have been installed in the nose, although this example just had an empty cavity in that position. They did consider ZLL launches, which stands for Zero Length Launch. The idea was that the rockets would augment the jet's engines, allowing for near instantaneous takeoff, not requiring a runway, so that these could be positioned anywhere. No longer was an airport required to defend high-value targets, and instead they could position one of these inside an average-looking shed. Producing over 130,000 pounds of thrust, North American determined that the X-26A booster used for the Snark missile could provide enough thrust. It could be prepared for launch in 8 minutes, with the pilot starting the turbojet, raising the F-107 up to 17 degrees, then firing the rocket until it's expended and then dropping, and the plane continues onto the target with its regular engine. Results from the test program were underwhelming and not much came from it, but it certainly made for some impressive footage of a few launches of other aircraft. North American Aviation found itself competing with the Republic F-105 Thunderchief, and in March 1957, the USAF decided to go with the latter, so the F-107 was relegated to aerodynamic testing. This one and the third jet were given to NACA, who then continued flying for another year. In the end, 272 test flights took place, giving engineers invaluable data. Republic Aviation went on to build 833 F-105s, and almost half at 382 were lost to enemy fire or mishaps. In fact, it's the only American aircraft to have been removed from combat because of the high loss rate. It did, however, return in a wild weasel role to suppress enemy radar and missile systems. So considering its limited successes, it would be interesting to speculate what might have been if the F-107 got the contract. In the end though, the Air Force was looking for a bomber, and the F-105 had both a proper internal bomb bay and a much larger bomb load of 14,000 pounds versus the F-107's 10,000 pound limit. It's possible that there were other political factors as well. North American Aviation were busy with many other projects, including the upcoming XB-70, XF-108, and A5 Vigilante. Republic, on the other hand, had nothing else in the pipeline nor anything after the F-105, and eventually were bought by Fairchild. As so happened, only one of those North American aviation projects I just mentioned went into production, leaving the company also in dire straits. It merged with Rockwell and was eventually purchased by Boeing. I have many other similar videos on my channel, including guided tours around the other Century series of jets, including the F-100 and the F-105 that I've mentioned throughout the video. Please support me as I make these videos and consider becoming a channel member. If the finances are tight at the moment, then that's fine, but please give the video a thumbs up because that's completely free. Thanks for watching.